Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. We're going to be recapping the Week 5 action and beginning to preview what you are going to see in Week 6. Before we get to that, the two teams that will be on bye for Week 6 will be the Green Bay Packers, who play tonight, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. One note with the Steelers is that I have now ranked Jaylen Warren ahead of Najee Harris in fantasy in back-to-back weeks. That is going to continue. I simply don't believe you can start Najee Harris in fantasy anymore. Maybe we'll get one or two matchups later in the season, but ultimately my expected fantasy points model still has them 2 full fantasy points apart in Warren's favor. And Warren's also just been outproducing Najee in terms of expectation. So you put it all together, Jaylen Warren, 10 fantasy points a game on the season. Najee Harris, 6.5. On a less depressing note, we have a fun divisional matchup for Thursday Night Football in Week 6. Broncos at the Chiefs. Chiefs, 10.5 point favorites in this one. Game totals nice and high at 51. Ryan, I certainly think Patrick Mahomes, the Chiefs, this is a kind of a get-right game that they really need, because as someone that watched Chiefs-Vikings, as I assume you did as well, despite the high-scoring game, to me at least, it did not even feel like either of those teams deserved more than a couple touchdowns apiece. Is that kind of what you took away from watching the Chiefs' offense in that one?
Yeah, outside of the Chiefs shredding the Bears this year, their offense has been kind of underwhelming, kind of a bit of a negative surprise on that front. That said, Denver's been getting smoked by everyone, so if you're an MVP bettor, now might be a good time to dabble on Patrick Mahomes, because his odds are probably going to increase after this week, assuming that they beat Denver. And in general, Kansas City needs speed. I think that's obvious. Rashid Rice consistently looks like the best receiver on the team. His usage isn't great, which you'll speak to, but and then on top of that, the defense has actually been the better unit so far through the first 5 games, which is, I think, would surprise most people.
I would agree. Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. Speaking of Rashid Rice, here's how you should buy low on him from your league mates. Let them know that he only ran 10 routes in Week 5, which is the truth. The second fewest routes he's run on the season. He was running 19 routes a game in Weeks 3 and Weeks 4. That dipped. That is how you can sell it. Ultimately, he was targeted on half of his routes. So 5 targets on only 10 routes this past week. 4 of his 5 games now, he has at least 5 targets from Patrick Mahomes. Overall, he's been targeted on 36% of his routes. So if he runs 3 routes, he's getting a target. And then even a little bit more than that. Like you said, looks like the best receiver on Kansas City. He's up to 8 end zone targets through those 5 games. The touchdowns are going to pile up. I think we could be looking at a kind of guy where he could finish the season with 700 yards and 11 touchdowns. That's the type of thing that I think is in his range of outcomes, being that he's on the Chiefs, being that Kadarius Toney does not seem like he'll ever have a full-time role. Sky Moore is a bust. Marquez Valdes-Scantling is a situational field stretcher. And I still believe Justin Watson might be leading this team in receiving yards, that is out of the non-Travis Kelce guys, which has to be one of the weirdest stats of the season. Let's turn to the Broncos in this game. Ryan, what did you see out of them? I mean, we called it. We called it for weeks. Sean Payton disparages Nathaniel Hackett's coaching job, and then sure enough, the Broncos lose that game. What did you see from Broncos country?
Yeah, I mean, the Jets were a bad matchup for them. I took the Jets in my spread pool, so the outcome wasn't totally surprising. Russell Wilson's still not consistent, but he has his moments. I might even frame last week's game as his worst of the year so far, but against the Jets defense, that wasn't really unexpected. And, the Broncos defense continues to just be like, I don't know what's happening. The Breece Hall broke off a big run, and the hole, I might have got 5 yards out of that hole. So, I going into Kansas City this week on a short week seems like it's going to be bad for Denver.
I agree. One note on Denver that I think is interesting. Javonte Williams doesn't really have a clear role in this backfield. I think anyone that has him in fantasy has kind of noticed you couldn't really start him. He obviously missed this past week with an injury, but if we look at the best rushing performances by a Broncos running back this year, it's Week 4, Jaleel McLaughlin, 7 carries, 72 yards. The second best one was Jaleel McLaughlin, Week 5, 9 carries, 68 yards. Javonte's best performance this year was 13 carries for 52 yards back in Week 1. And then on the other side, Samaje Perine has now led this backfield in routes run all 5 weeks. So you got Perine, who's locked into passing work. McLaughlin, who's simply outproducing and more explosive looking than Javonte, I'd be very concerned if I had Javonte in fantasy because he looks like the typical bench clogger where you're like, you know what? He's too good to drop, but he's never good enough to start. And this is exactly the type of player that we want to avoid in fantasy. Let's turn to the Sunday slate. Ravens at the Titans. Titans 4-point underdogs at home. Game total is very low, only 40.5. When we look at Baltimore, one thing that I think is interesting is that at least from last week, and I think just based on play this year, Nelson Aguilar is starting to look like the wide receiver 2 in this offense rather than Rashad Bateman. Aguilar ran twice as many routes as Bateman this past week. Ultimately, Aguilar's the guy that had 4 catches and 64 yards when Odell Beckham and Rashad Bateman combined for just 21 yards. What did you see out of this Ravens team in a game where they looked like they were dominating the Steelers, and then the Steelers just came back? And it turns out that when you score 10 points against any NFL team, that is usually not going to be enough.
I mean, Jackson usually struggles against Pittsburgh. We said that all last week. Overall, the Ravens had a number of drops in this game, which kind of turned this one. In particular, Aguilar had one downfield where Jackson dropped it right in between his arms. So I think that was essentially the difference in this game. That said, Jackson had 45 yards rushing. This offense really has not impressed me as much as it's impressed most people. It reminds me a bit of Daniel Jones' offense last year, a lot of dink and dunk stuff. But, at the end of the day, 45 yards rushing, 10 points. I'm not sure why anyone's super enthusiastic, even with the drops.
Let's turn to the Titans. DeAndre Hopkins, best game as a Titan. This past week, he caught 8 of 11 targets for 140 yards. We talked about why we liked Hopkins last week. The Colts continue to be a good team to target for your receivers. Hopkins now at 12 fantasy points a game in PPR formats. My expected fantasy points model, which looks at his usage, doesn't have him at 12. It has him at 14.5. Looking like a little bit of a nice buy low. Still yet to have a touchdown in 2023. What did you see from the Titans here? They was a tough loss. Any positives, or was it mostly, wow, you lost to the Colts in a game where Richardson once again didn't make it out of that game?
Yeah, I mean, over the last 2 years, the Titans have been the toughest team for me to peg. They're a bit up and down. Like last week, they completely dominated the Bengals, and this week, like you said, they lost to the Colts. Colts have been trending in a good direction, but this is a game Tennessee had to win if you want to factor into the playoff race here. In general, I had a very good week in winter pools this week, and this game is the one I got wrong across the board. Pretty much, I was on the Titan side. Tajay Spears continues to look good. Like you said, DeAndre Hopkins had a big week. I thought it was DeAndre Hopkins' week going in. Glad to see that popped off, but still, the Titans' passing attack is still pretty underwhelming, and I was very, very surprised by the Colts' success on the ground against Tennessee.
Yeah, we'll get to that shortly, Mr. Zach Moss. Anyway, Panthers at the Dolphins. Dolphins are, count them up, 14-point favorites in this one. Game total is at 48. That means a lot of points for the Dolphins. Very, very few points for the Panthers. I believe, top of my head, what does that make it? 29-15? Nope, that's way off. 29-17? Yeah. We won't do math on air.
Yeah.
Talking about the Panthers. Miles Sanders has no role. I don't know what's going on right now. The first 3 weeks, Miles Sanders averages 14 carries, 7 targets a game, 13 fantasy points a game. And then the past 2 weeks, 10 carries a game, while Chuba's had 11.5 during that stretch, and just 2 targets per game. Chuba Hubbard's actually scored 6 fantasy points a game the past 2 weeks. That doesn't sound exciting until you realize that that's 30% more than Miles Sanders has been scoring. Sanders has 9 fantasy points total over the past 2 weeks. It looks like a true 50-50 committee is brewing here. And on an offense that we simply don't like, I think you've called them the most unwatchable offense at times. It's probably them and the Giants oscillating between who you hate to watch more.
Yeah.
50-50 committee in that backfield is certainly not what we want. I wouldn't say you should drop Sanders or Chuba, but I think it's pretty close where this is just not a situation that's ever going to breed fantasy points. And then before I turn it over to you, Adam Thielen. Good call, Jordan Fanek, once again. Thielen looks like an every week fantasy wide receiver too. The past 4 weeks, so if we just take out week 1 where he was easing in with Bryce Young, past 4 weeks, he's averaged 11 targets, 9 catches, 96 yards, and he scored 3 times over that span, 23 fantasy points a game on average these past 4 weeks. Great call, Jordan. Thielen. Does he look like he's back, or is this more out of necessity because the receiving core simply has no other target earners out there?
Yeah, I'm going to say more out of necessity. He's just a reliable veteran that, as Jordan put out, he runs crossers well. That's one of the staples of this offense. So, again, like you said, hats off to Jordan. I'm pretty sure he was the only guy I saw that was even mildly enthusiastic on Adam Thielen entering the year. One thing I'm going to throw in here for Carolina is this team, after they fired Matt Rule, went on a run with Steve Wilkes where they almost made the playoffs. You have to, after this game, especially the Lions went in this game with a bunch of injuries, and they just got demolished. You have to wonder if that was a mistake letting Wilkes go, especially with how the 49ers defense is playing. So there were a lot of coverage malfunctions in this game for Carolina where they really need their bye in week 7. Let's just put it that way.
They really do.
Yeah.
When we turn to the Dolphins end, Devon Achane, my expected fantasy points model has him at over 21 fantasy points a game. A lot of people are really worried that you see the number of touches. And I always stress it's not really the number of touches. Obviously, it doesn't hurt to have volume, but what's more important is where the touches come from. Achane's getting the high value touches. These past 3 games, he's averaged 4 red zone carries a game. He's averaged 1 goal line carry a game. He has 4 red zone targets over these past 3 games. And despite the knee injury where he might miss a week, 1 week, when I put out my rest of season rankings and trade value chart, which comes out on Wednesday, free on the 33rdteam.com, he will be moving up again. He was in tier 4. We will see. Is he going to reach tier 2? He will at least be in tier 3. I truly do not care if my running back is going to miss 1 week in week 6. Ultimately, this is we love this role. The guy that gets all the high value touches in an offense. Like the way that I would frame it at this point, it's almost like if you knew Tyreek Hill's getting like 12 touches a game manufactured for him, you'd start him. That's kind of how we should think about Achane in a way. Just what he does per touch. Tyreek's really the only guy I can think of right now in the league that's better and happens to be on his team. One other thing, I don't know if Ryan, you picked up on this watching, but Waddle led the team with 10 targets, 28 routes. Tyreek Hill only ran 18 routes in this game. So I'm not sure if they're just keeping him fresh, but it didn't really matter because on those 18 routes, somehow he had 9 targets and caught 8 for 181 yards and a touchdown. I think we like that. We're not really too concerned. Did he get nicked up, or were they simply just saving him because it was the Giants and they knew they were going to steamroll them?
Probably just like this game was in control the whole way. So probably just saving him. Here's what I'll say about Miami. Going into last year, the combination of Hill and Waddle, like an unprecedented speed duo in the history of the league, plus with that San Francisco style running attack that Mike McDaniel designs. They're the first team in my entire football life where I wouldn't know how I'd handle them from a defensive play calling standpoint, from a macro standpoint. I have no idea what I would do. Now you bring Achane into the mix again. A speedster, a young speedster. We saw him break another big run against the Giants in this San Francisco style rushing attack. I don't know how you handle these guys, and they're especially going to be a problem for a Panthers team who gave up 42 points to the Lions last week.
Yeah, it's finally someone is playing the NFL like we've always played Madden all these years, where you sort by speed and you go, I only want players with 95 speed or higher on my team. The Dolphins finally said, you know what, we're going to try it. So far, this experiment, highly successful. Let's turn. You're speaking of the Lions. How about the Lions at the Bucs? Bucs are only 3-point underdogs. You might be like, wow, that is crazy. Have you seen the Lions recently? Remember, though, the Bucs are coming off their bye. This is a nice, fresh, well-rested team. Game total is quite high at 45.5. Looking at Detroit, David Montgomery, or should we call him Money Montgomery, has at least 17 touches in every game, averaging 21 fantasy points a game. My expected fantasy points model has him at 20.5 fantasy points, basically the same, because the guy is getting such outrageous work in the red zone near the goal line. He's just in every week mid-range fantasy RB1. We love to see that. We were recommending that you drafted him in the 6th, 7th round of fantasy. Turns out we probably should have recommended that you take him in the 2nd round if you only had one draft for your life, because that's kind of what he's performing like at this point. So very excited to see that. Less excited about Jameson Williams. Apologies to everyone out there that I told to place some long shot bets on Jameson Williams this past game. Targeted 3 times on 15 routes. He caught 2 passes for 2 yards. Totaled a whopping 3 air yards on these 3 targets. I'm not panicking yet. It's his first game back, but it definitely was gave me a little PTSD from last year when he just never really got going. Do you have anything to add here on JMO? Or should we just talk more about Jared Goff's home road splits at this point, where he is Tom Brady at home and then he's Zach Wilson on the road?
That's a tough parallel. Oh man. No, I think Jameson Williams is probably he's a better and best ball type player, and he's good for their offense just because of the skill set that he brings. But Detroit has so many weapons, it's probably going to start to get hard to peg who to play in each given week, especially when Amon Ra comes back.
Looking at Tampa Bay, they're coming off a week 5 bye. So we'll talk about them more on our Thursday show when we preview these games and these matchups more in depth. Get ready for that. Seahawks Bengals. Bengals favored by 3 points. And you might be like, well, that's disrespectful because the Bengals finally look good again. But remember, Seahawks also coming off of a week 5 bye. They're well rested. Game total's high at 46.5. Let's talk about the Bengals. Ryan, it's time for us to do a little dance. I have been so terrified about this offense, about Jamar Chase. Jamar Chase is back. Jamar Chase versus Justin Jefferson. Both are averaging 22 fantasy points a game. My expected fantasy model actually has Chase projected for 2 more fantasy points a game than Jefferson based on his usage, because Chase is averaging 2 red zone and 1 end zone targets per game. It has been simply outrageous in the red zone. He finally had the 3 touchdown game. He kind of was stacking up the expected touchdowns. He finally delivered this past week. Are the Bengals fully back? And congrats on hitting the nice Joe Mixon rushing yards prop. Mixon, best game of the season, 81 yards. Not super efficient, but ultimately got it done on the stat sheet. Are you less concerned about your Bengals?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. Burrow looked like himself again, which was great. I also I bet on this. I bet on Jamar Chase in game because I saw how things were trending. I was like, they can't do anything here. Arizona looked more. We'll get into them later, but Arizona more looked like the Cardinals we were expecting entering the year last week. So I'm encouraged, especially because Burrow looked good from a mobility standpoint, but still want to see a little bit more. This is a tough matchup against Seattle, where Seattle, the Bengals are still in desperation mode to a degree. So I'm going to wait another week before I completely celebrate. That said, I'll say this about their defense. Their defense is definitely not what it was last year. The loss of Jesse Bates limits what they can do defensively. I think, going into the year, we viewed them as a shootout team, and I think we're going to start to see more of that now.
Do you think Lou Anarumo, their defensive coordinator, made a mistake? I know he was getting some offers for a higher position. He wanted to return to the Bengals, and quite honestly, like you said, the defense just hasn't looked quite as good. Or is this more simply, hey, you lost one of your two best players on defense, and that's what happens?
I think if you were already considering him for a head coaching position, you'd be smart enough to understand that the Cincinnati Bengals roster defensively is like a bottom 5, bottom 10 unit. So maybe a little bit, but it's a very good question. I would lean towards he's still probably okay.
All right, let's move on to the AFC South. Colts at Jaguars. Jags favored by 4.5 points. Game totals at 45.5. The first thing we have to talk about the Colts is not Jonathan Taylor. It's Anthony Richardson. The news came out the AC joint sprain was not like Derek Carr. This was a grade 3. Richardson projected to miss 4 to 6 weeks. Every Twitter doctor in the atmosphere has said that him going on IR in the next 2 days is it's practically a certainty at this point. And then on Jonathan Taylor's end, he was really, 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 really eased in. This was Zach Moss week against the best run defense in the NFL. And the Titans, Zach Moss, 23 carries, 165 yards, 2 touchdowns. Moss had 8 red zone carries. Oh, I mean, maybe I'm just too optimistic about Taylor, but this just made me so excited about next week and the week after when Jonathan Taylor starts to get eased in. I didn't actually think Taylor looked particularly good in this game. I kind of want to hear what your thoughts are on Taylor and then your thoughts on how they need to modify these game plans to keep Richardson healthy.
He just needs to take less contact, like Josh Allen takes a ton of contact, but Lamar Jackson really doesn't, for instance, And Anthony Richardson's kind of like a cross between the two of them. He's a more physical player like Allen, but he's not quite as fast as Jackson, but he's at least in the same ballpark. So just less contact. On that note, Josh, when I release power rankings tomorrow, Colts fans are not going to be happy with where I have them, and that's primarily because Richardson's going to be out for weeks. And while Gardner Minshew's a great backup, it just limits the ceiling of this team in general. And to answer your question about the run game, we talked about this last week and the week before. Zach Moss has looked like a different player. If he looked like this in Buffalo, he'd still be there. It's very, very bizarre. And he did. He looked faster and more explosive than Jonathan Taylor. I'm not sure I want to bet on that continuing, especially since, Taylor's played his first NFL game this season. Like you said, they eased him in for a reason. But it is something to keep an eye on, actually.
Yeah, just more ammo in the pocket of these front offices that don't want to pay running backs. You give Jonathan Taylor 3 years, $42 million just to watch Zach Moss look like the better player. I'm glad that it wasn't just me, because as I mentioned to everyone over and over on the show, I watch a lot of football, but I'm an analytics guy. Ryan is the film guy. But as I watched that game, there were a few carries where I was like, oh, wow. And every single time it was Zach Moss. Looking at Jacksonville, another running back that we love, Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne, this guy looks good. Handled 26 of the 29 rush attempts. Handled 31 of the 36 running back routes. Catches 4 of 5 targets. No other running back was targeted, but more importantly, those 26 carries amounted to 136 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. He had 48 receiving yards. Gosh, we've been ETN guys for a while. It seemed like we were some of the only people this offseason that were willing to put our foot down and say, Travis Etienne is better than Tank Bigsby, and we're going to draft him in the 3rd and 4th round of fantasy. And a lot of people were so convinced that was like, there were a lot of analysts out there that we respected who were saying, Etienne may be the worst round 3 pick out there. That certainly does not look the case through 5 weeks. A couple other quick notes on the receivers. Zay Jones re-injured his knee. I think IR is probably likely. If he misses 2 weeks, comes back and re-injures the knee, giving me shades of the Keenan Allen, Mike Williams experience that me as a Chargers fan suffered through last year, where they both came back preemptively, both got re-injured, and it was like, all right, guys, just take them out for a month, then we'll see them. And then Calvin Ridley, second 100-yard game of the season. I think everyone panicking is probably doing that prematurely. He didn't play football for a couple years, and I think he looks pretty good. What did you see out of this Jags team, the upset in London?
Well, like we talked about, that the upset didn't really surprise me. It's such a bizarre scenario where the Jaguars essentially played in London 2 weeks in a row, and Buffalo had to come there. Just a really weird, unprecedented advantage for Jacksonville there. So not a surprise. Something I'll mention about ETN is a couple weeks ago, Calvin Ridley caught a pass on the sideline, and somehow ETN caught him and got in front of him. Just like, he's maybe the most explosive running back in the league. He's at least in the conversation. We saw that last week. Tank Bigsby going into the year, I said he reminds me of Alexander Madison. So far, I've looked good there. Still time for that to change a little bit, but ETN's definitely the guy in Jacksonville, as he should be. And here's one thing I'll say for bettors out there. Trevor Lawrence is one of those premium quarterback options. When you have him as a significant underdog, I'm almost just going to take him in general, because I don't think that's going to happen very many times over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think schedule makers out there, you really hurt the Bills, because this was a, quote, Bills home game. I think that's the funniest part, is that it wasn't even like, you'd think if they were going to let the Jaguars stay in London for back-to-back weeks, they'd say, okay, this is your home game. But no, the Bills actually used up one of their home games, traveling to London to face a non-jet lagged Jags team that, as we predicted, would be pretty close, and they lost. Moving on, we've got a nice NFC North matchup. The Vikings travel on the road to Soldier Field to face the Bears. I'll wait for your accent for that one. Bears only 3-point underdogs. I guess that's what happens when you beat the Commanders 40-20 on primetime and then get 10 days off. Spread is high, or game total is high at 49. I think I'm inclined to agree there. I don't really see either of these defenses stopping these offenses. The big thing with Minnesota, Justin Jefferson has a hamstring injury. We'll go to one of my favorite stats, targets per route run. We see that Hawkinson is at 22% for the season. Jordan Addison's at 17%. KJ Osborne at 13%. I think that's probably how it's going to be in terms of if Jefferson were to miss time. Hawkinson leads in targets, followed by Addison, followed by KJ Osborne. Do you have any other thoughts here on this Jefferson hamstring injury and what it means for the Vikings and their season?
So for the Vikings, the offense left a lot of opportunities against the Chiefs last week. I actually thought they could have won that game. And without Jefferson and Hawkinson late in the game, the offense, it's an entirely different team. It goes from being a premium passing attack to a borderline below average one in that scenario. And another thing I'm going to throw in here is if Jefferson misses this game, the Vikings aren't better than the Bears. They might be a little bit more consistent, but I actually think the Bears have a higher ceiling as a team than Minnesota in that scenario. I'm
inclined to agree there. We just saw what they can do. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like they actually, maybe it's an indictment on the Commanders pass rush, but I actually thought the protection was pretty good on primetime, where Fields was making some good reads and he was actually getting 2-3 seconds in the pocket completely untouched on a lot of those pass plays to DJ Moore in particular. Were you generally impressed with not just Fields, but how the offensive line played? Because to me, amateur film grinder, I was like, oh, Justin Fields, a fairly clean pocket on most of these passes.
I actually wrote this in the matchups column for that. Is the Bears offensive line hasn't been the problem this year. It's been more so play calling. But yes, the Commanders front four is like a top 10 unit in that regard. And Chicago played very well in that game. And here's what I'll say about the Bears offense in general. They did this last year. First 4 games, terrible, horrible. Eyesore to watch. Then in week 5 in Minnesota, Fields was a guy who carried an offense. Then they took a step back the week after on a short week. Then they went on a 5-game tear that started in New England and at Dallas, where they were a top 5 offense in the league. Then Fields got hurt and everyone forgot that happened. And we're looking at the same thing here. The play calling in particular in the last 2 weeks has been better. That's the thing that I'm most encouraged by. And, they have better tools this season. And Fields, Fields may not be consistent, but Fields is a pretty interesting high ceiling quarterback from a week to week standpoint.
Yeah. First 3 games of the year under 18 fantasy points. Now Fields has back-to-back games with 30. Looking at the running back room, Khalil Herbert has a high ankle sprain. He's probably out for at least 3, 4, maybe even 5 or 6 weeks. Roschon Johnson's in concussion protocol. This is such a mess. I'd say that he's going to be the top ad. We'll talk about that on our waiver show tomorrow. That'll be streamed on Twitter, YouTube, etc. It'll be in the Apple and Spotify feed. The 33rd Team Podcast Network is what you need to search. And our own guy, Nick Bodiford, will have his waiver column coming out really, really soon on the 33rdteam.com. He'll update that both today and tomorrow with all the top ads. And he'll talk about that backfield more in depth. So I don't want to spoil that, but he will be touching, don't worry, everyone, he'll be touching on Roschon Johnson and Deonta Foreman and how he expects that split to go. One other note on the Bears. I generally worship my model. I'm an analytics guy. I love the expected fantasy points model. I am refusing to take its advice with DJ Moore. DJ Moore expected fantasy points 13.5. Fantasy points per game, though, on the season, 22. Essentially, what he's doing after the catch, some may say it's unsustainable. As someone that has been watching him, I think he can just keep doing this. He's breaking tackles at an incredible rate. He's always been one of the sneaky, fast receivers. They're finally starting to give him a route tree that I know you're more optimistic about long-term. Would you agree that Moore, if anything, is kind of a buy high? That's sort of how I'm viewing him right now. Is if I had to take a stance in fantasy, I'd say buy high on DJ Moore rest of season.
I'm not sure I want to buy him after a 200-yard performance, but in general, yeah, I think things are trending in a good direction. Justin Fields' statistics are outrageous when he targets Moore too. Moore's fast, yak player, short area quickness. Again, like if he averages, say, 6 catches for 80 yards the rest of the way, that makes sense to me. I wouldn't expect 203 touchdowns very often, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, neither would I. I've just never seen people discount this type of performance so much, which is why I wanted to say it out there, right, that if anyone out there is just trying to sell Moore and they're like, oh, let me get rid of him after this performance.
Yeah,
I would be in the market for that, yeah, with that league made.
Yeah.
One other note that I forgot to mention for the Vikings, just because we hate Alexander Madison, of course, as a person, everything like that. Yeah. Layer it on. He split carries 8-5 with Cam Akers this past week. And he split targets 3-2 with Cam Akers as well. That is simply not good. Maybe it's a little more run game focused if Jefferson misses time, but certainly if Madison was barely getting it done in fantasy all alone, certainly not good if Mr. Cam Akers is in there to take almost half the touches. Let's turn to Saints at Titans. Saints at Texans. Texans just 2.5-point underdogs. Our Texans, they're looking quite good. Game total's low at 40.5. Texans defense has looked pretty good this year. Saints defense just scored 26 fantasy points against the Patriots. They shut them out. When we look at the Saints end of things, I think just a general trend with Kamara that I thought was interesting. The first 4 years of his career, he averaged only 11 carries a game. The last 3 years of his career, as he's getting older, not 11 carries a game, 16.5 carries a game. Obviously, we think he's a very good pure runner. That's what makes Kamara so special, is that he's good everywhere. but his really elite trait is the pass catching and when you get him in space. So I thought this was very puzzling. I want to get your take on this, but before I do, I mentioned that Kendre Miller looks like the clear backup. And I think even if Jamal Williams returns, he might keep it. Miller looking decent. He had 12 carries this past week, and he caught all 4 of his targets as well. That's very, very good for the third-round rookie. Have you been surprised by Kamara's usage as well? And any other notes on this Saints team?
Yeah, I thought it was odd last year. The same thing, like why this guy's one of the most dynamic pass catching running backs ever, but we're leaning into him more as a between the tackle player. It's worked for so long. I don't know why you'd change things. That said, Josh, I'm going to tell you this because it's about Kendre Miller. There was a reception early in the game where I think Miller got 33 yards on it, and while I'm watching, I'm like, wow, Kamara looks like he's got some juice going right now. And then I realized it was Miller, so Miller is definitely a stash for me. I agree with you. I think he could overtake Jamal Williams even in the short term once he returns. And in general, say something happens to Kamara down the stretch, I think Miller is one of those guys. You like taking rookies; they peak late. He's definitely a guy I want on my bench if possible. And here I'll also say this: I expected New Orleans to win this game primarily because the Patriots are so injured. I was not expecting them to win 34-0. The defense got a score early. Offense didn't have to do so much. I like that Carr's toughen out this injury, but their passing attack is more limited right now.
When we look at the Texans side, congratulations, CJ Stroud. You are now the NFL record holder for most passes to begin a career without throwing a pick. He still has yet to throw a pick. And Dameon Pierce, I know you were very high on him this offseason. It got me interested in him. Hasn't worked out so far, but hashtag the process because the guy's usage has been great. He's averaging 13 expected fantasy points a game. That's only been at 9.5 in part because we couldn't really predict that the whole offensive line would get injured basically right before week 1 happened. So I think that's just unlucky, but I think a big game's coming. He had all 20 running back carries this past week. That's very exciting. Anything else to add here on the Texans?
Yeah, I mean, when your offensive line's down 4 starters, you're going to get hit in backfield a lot. That's just part of betting on this stuff. And I'll say this about Stroud. I've said this 2 weeks in a row. He had a late game 50-yard touchdown when they were up by 2 scores. Not real sustainable stuff. This week he had 249 yards passing and a touchdown. I think from a week-to-week fantasy baseline perspective, that's what we should be expecting instead of those inflated numbers. That said, if you're a Texans fan, you got to be absolutely thrilled with how well he's played. He's definitely exceeded my expectations. But from a fantasy perspective, he's more of a streamer for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you have to be excited about is that Stroud looks like he could be one of the next big quarterbacks where it's not just that he lasts the rookie deal, but that when he's extended, you're excited. Because as we've seen, very few second quarterback contracts actually seem to work out well for these teams because you simply have to have a top 5 to top 10 quarterback on that second contract. Stroud already looking like he could be that guy that's in Houston for the next decade and a half. Let's turn to Commanders at Falcons. Probably a little bit less exciting quarterback play in this one. Falcons 2-point favorites. Game total's low at 42. So Commanders just 20 implied points. Falcons 22 implied points. We don't get too excited about that. When we look at Washington, I know that they got smoked by the Bears, but I'd be remiss not to mention that Sam Howell kind of had a career game, at least for fantasy. Completed 73% of his 51 pass attempts for 388 yards and 2 touchdowns. But, and I mentioned this back-to-back weeks, he took 5 sacks again. He's still pacing for nearly 100 sacks taken in the season, which would set the record by about 20. He simply can't take that much contact. A couple other notes because I have a lot to say about the Commanders. Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, I do not like what I'm seeing. In a game where Howell drops back 51 times, they combined for less than a 20% target share combined. 10 targets. How do those two guys have 7 catches and 79 yards in a game where Howell throws for 388? Are you as concerned as I am? Because I've mentioned a few weeks now that for some reason, they're just not incorporating either of them into the offense like they should. And I think this was the worst one yet, where Howell throws for nearly 400 yards and you couldn't start either of them in fantasy.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned with McLaurin because I actually think McLaurin's good. Jahan Dotson, I've never really cared, so much. Guy who's taken in the first round that I thought was overdrafted by at least 30 slots. So that doesn't really surprise me too much. Curtis Samuel mixed in too. But with McLaurin, I've always thought that if McLaurin went to Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers, that he could have stepped into those shoes fairly well. So that does concern me. And with Howell, most of that came in garbage time, and like you said, the Commanders' pass protection is just absolutely horrendous. The Bears are maybe the worst front four in the league. They brought some more exotic pressure this week, bringing guys from the third level, bringing secondary players, but still, like, the Bears front four played their best game of the year, so that's probably going to be a long-term problem for Washington this season.
One thing to mention, because we can't just ding a team without giving credit where credit is due. Welcome Logan Thomas to a top 12 weekly fantasy option. I'd say we lost Hunter Henry these past few weeks, but we gained a Logan Thomas. Logan Thomas is now averaging more than 10 fantasy points a game, according to my expected fantasy points model. 7th best among tight ends. Only Kelsey, Andrews, Hawkinson, Zach Ertz, Kyle Pitts, of all guys, and Cole Kmet have better usage this season at tight end than Logan Thomas. And you can look at the box scores, and I think they'd tell you a similar story. Turning to Atlanta, we talked about, what was this, Howell's best game? I think this was probably Desmond Ritter's best game as well this past week. Completed 76% of 37 passes, 329 yards and a touchdown. Did he look about as good on film as he did in the stat sheet? I did like the final drive of the game to set up the field goal. It was nice. He relied on London. I think London had 3 catches for like 35 yards on that final drive. So ultimately, we like that for Drake London. We like that for Desmond Ridder. How did the whole game look, though, overall?
I've never been a big Ridder guy. He beat up on a lot of like mid-majors and such when he was in college with a superior roster. And in the NFL, this is either his best or second best game. The most encouraging thing for me is, we've talked about this. The Falcons have a very good roster. If Ridder is an NFL quarterback, this is a playoff team. And not only did he play well and produce well this week, they came out more aggressive in the air. So that was encouraging for me. And, if they can duplicate they don't even have to duplicate exactly what they did last week. If they can even get close, like if that's in the bag of tricks, this team can win 9 games.
Guys, nobody talks about football like Ryan. You can follow him on Twitter at Ryan Reynolds NFL. He's watched every snap of every game since 2014, and he still lives to tell about it. His power rankings will be up on the site soon, the33rdteam.com. Those are free to read. Later in the week, he'll release a few matchups previews for all the island games. He has his expert picks and predictions for every single game. They drop Thursday each week, which is also when we record our other podcast together. And Saturdays, you get his in-depth betting thoughts for each game. You want to know how he's looking at Survivor, Pick'em pool, or winner pools, player props, like ATS, pretty much anything that you can imagine. Ryan's probably betting on it successfully, and he'll give you his thoughts there. A couple other Falcons notes quickly. Tyler Algier outcarried Bijan Robinson in this game. I'm not worried. Bijan outsnapped him significantly. Bijan ran 3 times as many routes. We can all take a deep breath. Not every game are we going to see Bijan Robinson with 80% of the touches, and that's okay. And then Kyle Pitts led the team with 11 targets, caught 7 for 87 yards. He had 125 air yards. He still has the highest average depth of target among tight ends this year. I think the big issue is that as your targets are further downfield, quarterback play matters more. And as you mentioned, it's very unfortunate. We absolutely love the Kyle Pitts role if he had a competent quarterback. But when you're running routes farther downfield than anyone else at your position with Desmond Ridder, that's a recipe for inconsistency. And that is still, unfortunately, what we have for Pitts, even after one of the best games of his career. Next game, I'm very excited for this one. This might actually be the 2 best defenses in the NFL right now. Now that the Cowboys are starting to get injured, starting to fall off. We have the 49ers at the Browns. Browns are only 4-point underdogs. And as I'll mention, it's because Browns defense really, really good. Browns offense looks okay. And they're coming off of a week 5 bye. This is going to be a game I'm very excited for. Game total's low at 42. Probably going to be a nice defensive battle. When we look at the Niners, Ryan, I've got a question. Does Brock Purdy have a legitimate case to be one of the MVP frontrunners? Undefeated team. I know that you like when teams finish first in the conference. 254 passing yards per game. 9 touchdown passes. 0 picks this year. Completing 72% of passes. His quarterback rating is leading the NFL at 123. At this pace, he would set the record for highest quarterback rating in a season. Should we start betting on Brock Purdy, or when was the time to do that?
I mean, the time to do it was last week when I gave him at a 22-1 odds. I think he's still going to be in the mix. I've had the 49ers as the number one team in my power rankings since the Steelers game because they're the best team in the league. If you win your conference, you're in the MVP conversation. QBR, team success, rating, and touchdowns. It doesn't have to be touchdown passes. It can be rushing touchdowns too. If you're in the top 3 in those areas, you're in the hunt. I think he's still I wouldn't probably bet on him at plus 700 where he's at right now. Like I said, I think last week was the time to do it. But yes, he's one of the 4 guys or so that are going to be in this through the whole year.
The Browns, the only thing I'll say is that fortunately, they've had a lot of time for Deshaun Watson's shoulder to relax, for them to do some game planning. I did see that Watson still hasn't practiced yet. I'm not too concerned yet. It looked like he was almost good to go last week, but that is something that we'll be monitoring. I'll be monitoring with my fantasy rankings. So stay tuned for that. Next game's Patriots at Raiders. Raiders 2.5-point favorites. Will the bleeding stop at the Patriots? What have they been at? I think they've been outscored like 69-0 or 69-3 these past 2 games. Something ridiculous. That sounds like a made-up Belichick stat, and it's not. This has been the back-to-back worst losses of his career as a coach now. Raiders only 2.5-point favorites, though. Game total's 42.5. Raiders will be on a short week because they play the Packers tonight on Monday Night Football, so they'll only have 6 days rest before they host the Patriots. Looking at the Patriots, the second straight week, Mac Jones was taken out of the game late for Bailey Zappi. Zappi now has 9 pass attempts back-to-back games. I mean, the hatred continues. The backfield, we don't even like it for fantasy. It's a 50-50 committee. This past week, Ramondre Stevenson outsnapped Zeke 26-23. Both had 8 carries. Ramondre ran 15 routes. Zeke ran 10. Ramondre 2 targets. Zeke 4. You can't start either of them in fantasy, but at least Zeke didn't cost you a 3rd-round pick. Feeling pretty good still about the Ramondre Stevenson fade. And as I mentioned earlier, despite the hot start, I think you can drop Hunter Henry and pick up Logan Thomas in your fantasy leagues. Do you have anything positive to say about the Patriots? Because personally, I do not.
No, I mean, they've been at least semi-decimated by injuries on defense. Matthew Judon's probably the best player that isn't a household name on defense in the league. He's going to miss most of the season. That's a huge one for them. Completely changes their pass rush. And, I said this last week too. When they put Zappi in against Dallas, I found that they put him in the 3rd quarter. I found that mildly concerning. Where if they do it again, maybe we have a quarterback controversy here. Looks like we're there now, Josh.
We are. And as we mentioned before, the Raiders will play tonight on Monday Night Football. We'll look to see how they look against a pretty solid pass defense in the Packers. Turning to Eagles at Jets, another one that just depresses me when I think about what could have been Jalen Hurts, Aaron Rodgers. Instead, it's Jalen Hurts, Zach Wilson. Jets 6.5-point underdogs at home. Game total's low at 42.5. 2 premium defenses with 1 premium offense in this game. Looking at Philly, I'll talk about Dallas Goedert. I'm excited. He had 22 receiving yards a game through 4 weeks, and then he exploded in week 5, catches 8 and 9 targets, 117 yards, gets in the box with a score, and quietly, he now has 3 games with a target share of at least 20%, and he'll be moving up in my rest of season rankings. Wednesday, you can look for that. People seem to like my rest of season rankings, my tiered rankings, and the trade value chart that accompanied them. I will be doing an update. Dallas Goedert, sorry I disrespected you last week. I've seen you. You look like you're back. You will be moving up. How could you not move a guy up after 117 yards at the most fantasy points scarce position in football? What else did you see from the Eagles in this one?
I mean, just in general, they're on the short team. They're on the short list of teams that can beat you in basically any way. They still haven't played a ceiling game yet, despite being 5-0. So that's pretty interesting to me. For this game in particular, I think it's a trench game. Philly can mitigate the Jets' pass rush, which is important. And then on the other side of things, well, we'll talk about the Jets in a second, Josh.
Let's talk about the Jets. It's Breece Hall's backfield now. Very exciting. 22 carries, 177 yards, and a touchdown against the Broncos. Caught all 3 targets for 17 yards as well. We talked, I believe, 2 weeks ago on the waiver show, and I said, drop Dalvin Cook. He doesn't matter anymore. And sure enough, Dalvin Cook was outsnapped 20-10 by Michael Carter. While Cook had 6 carries to Carter's 1, Michael Carter ran 17 routes. Dalvin Cook only ran 4. Dalvin Cook at this point looks kind of like the RB3 in terms of projected fantasy points in this backfield. I think he's pretty officially washed. So drop Dalvin Cook, pick up a more fun running back, and Breece Hall. Borderline fantasy RB1 where we hate the offense, but we love the player, the talent, and I think we love the role now. What do you want to add here about the Jets? And talk to me about how Zach Wilson blew it. This was supposed to be his game. He was facing the Broncos. He blew it. He couldn't even have 200 passing yards against the worst defense in the NFL. I was never a Zach Wilson guy. You were never a Zach Wilson guy. We continue to remain not Zach Wilson guys.
I mean, here's the thing, Josh, especially since we work at a company that has a bunch of former NFL players and even current ones, everyone in the NFL is awesome. Even the worst player in the league is awesome. Like, for instance, I was a varsity athlete when I was 15 years old. I was good. I was an all-county hitter, so on and so forth. My correction came, again, 15-year-old sophomore, against a pitcher who was drafted in the first round in the Major League Baseball draft out of high school and his 96-mile-an-hour fastball. I thought I was good until that moment. That said, Zach Wilson stinks, and I hate watching him play. You know, this team's 4-1. This team's 4-1 with Aaron Rodgers. Is a genuine shame what's happening here. I mean, the Jets scored 20 points on offense against the Chiefs, and people were celebrating this as like a great game out of Zach Wilson when his defense had 2-3 turnovers too. Just he's a good game for him as if the Jets score 24 points and he doesn't turn the ball over 2 or 3 times at this point. Just this was the ceiling game for him, and it didn't happen. Thank God. Thankfully, Breece Hall went absolutely crazy.
Breece Hall went crazy, and I think the sports books loved that. While they hemorrhaged money on those Breece Hall overs, they got a lot of that money back when everyone bet the Zach Wilson overs. I think it was 202.5 passing yards. Wilson couldn't even muster 200 against the Broncos. Let's turn to the Cardinals at the Rams. Rams 6-point favorites. Game totals 47. So nearly 4 touchdowns projected for the Rams in this one. When we look at the Cardinals, James Conner has a knee injury. We'll keep you updated with the waiver article, the waiver show coming out tomorrow that we do on how to handle the Arizona backfield. It's right now there is zero info. Anyone claiming to have info probably doesn't have info because no one has come forward with any kind of diagnosis. We will stay up to date for you, the good people. And then Marquise Brown. I mentioned on a few offseason shows, I'm going to take a little victory lap. Can't spin in my chair right now because it's background, but I told people, I said, I think Marquise Brown will be just good enough to start early in the season. And then all you're going to do is salivate about when Kyler Murray returns. And I said, that was my favorite receiver at ADP. That one's looking pretty good right now. I'm excited. 10 targets in 3 of his past 4 games. I think he's the most elite buy that you can make receiver-wise in fantasy because Kyler's returning soon. Marquise Brown already giving you 15 fantasy points a game in PPR formats, so you can start him now. Come the fantasy playoffs, we could be looking at 20 fantasy points a game. Cardinals, they came back to life in this one against the Bengals this past week. They started to look a little more like the team we expected to be in the running for Caleb Williams. What do you want to add here about this team?
Well, I'll start with the Cardinals here. Hollywood Brown, wide open on a deep shot very early in the game, not the one he caught. Misfired. You know, he could have had a 2-touchdown, 140-yard game if all things went in his direction. Like you said, the Cardinals, I think this was their worst game of the year. They couldn't stop Jamar Chase. Their run defense was solid, though. I know, like you said with Joe Mixon, I bet on his over rushing yards. And when I bet on overs or unders, I'm either betting on a you should spike or it's a game script dependent thing where I think their usage is going to be down. So I got it right from that standpoint, but I sweated it much more than I thought because he had 22 carries.
I think it was 25 for 81. I think it was like 3 yards a carry pretty much.
Yeah, it was all grinding it out against a pretty solid Cardinals run defense.
Let's turn to the Rams. Cooper Kupp, 12 targets, 8 catches, 118 yards in his debut. Puka Nacua, though, 11 targets to Kupp's 12, caught 7 for 71 yards and a touchdown. We didn't want you selling Puka Nacua for pennies on the dollar just because Kupp was coming back. This is why. Admittedly, both of us said we think Puka was more of a sell than a buy last week, but I also put him in tier 3 of my trade value chart. I put him as one of the most premium assets, a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy football. And I said, guys, if you're going to sell Puka, which I would, I'd sell him at this price. I would not just be like, oh yeah, like give me Michael Pittman. No.
Oh, right.
I think we're all glad that even though we weren't obsessed with Puka, we recognize the potential. Yeah. And it looks like we may have 2 fantasy wide receiver ones in this Rams offense. We've seen the Dolphins, the Eagles now, where two receivers command 50 to 60% of the targets each week. I think the Rams are there. I think Kupp and Puka are probably going to flirt with 55 to 60% of the team's targets every week going forward. And we love that for fantasy. And we love for Matthew Stafford that he has a very, very competent looking receiving core now. What else do you want to add here? Where ultimately, despite all this rosiness, I myself was disappointed. It felt like the Rams really got going in the first half. And then correct me if I'm wrong, it looked like a different offense in the second half of that game.
Well, from a pure talent standpoint, Philly's just significantly better than them. I was actually surprised the line moved towards the Rams side. I thought the Eagles were going to win this game by at least a score just because of that. That said, and I say this every week now, Josh, Matthew Stafford has just been so good this year. So many high difficulty throws. If Puka Nacua was a giant, no one would know who he is. A big reason he's having as much success as he has is Matthew Stafford sticks footballs in areas that no one else will. That said, Cooper Kupp looked awesome. Puka Nacua is still a factor on the trade front, Josh. I know someone asked me, would you trade Puka Nacua for Jamar Chase? My answer is yes. Run to the window for that, please. But Michael Pittman, no, we don't. No, let's not do that. Here's where I'd be on the fence with Puka Nacua. If you offered me T. Higgins for Puka Nacua, I think I'd stay pat, which wouldn't have been the case before the season, even though I wasn't really high on T. Higgins. Same with Devonta Smith. I think those are the kind of guys that are decisions where I think I might even lean Puka in those scenarios.
I think, not only is Puka going to outproduce them most weeks, what if Kupp gets hurt again? Kupp's 30. Right. Terrifying injury history.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I don't think he's better than those guys, but I do think he's in a better situation, especially because the rest of the Rams roster outside of quarterback, offensive line, and Aaron Donald is a little dicey. Their offensive line's actually been much better this year than it was last year. It's one of the reasons they've been pretty solid, but they're going to be playing at a talent deficit most weeks, and this is a pass-centric offense.
Let's turn to Sunday Night Football. Giants at the Bills. God, too much Giants primetime. We're not the only ones that have noticed and are complaining. And, good old primetime game where the Bills are 14.5-point favorites. That is certainly not good for the NFL product, getting displayed to a large audience. Game total is pretty high, though, at 46.5. Thank you, Bills. Looking at the Giants, Daniel Jones has a neck injury. Don't believe he misses time. We're getting robbed of the exciting Tyrod Taylor revenge game against the Bills. One other quick note, Eric Gray led the backfield in carries. Matt Breida led this backfield in routes run. I think both are droppable in fantasy because ultimately we talked before with the Panthers, we hate 50-50 committees. So if on the off chance Saquon misses time again this year and then we get another 50-50 committee and a bad offense, I'm not excited. We want true handcuffs on our bench, not these one injury away, then becomes a committee back. Don't pick up Eric Gray and drop Matt Breida. Saquon nearly played this game. He should be back for week 6. And Darren Waller, 8 catches, 86 yards on 11 targets. Those are all season highs for any Giants receiver. Darren Waller looks like he's not dead yet. A little bit excited about him rest of season now that we kind of the ceiling game we thought could happen did in fact happen. Anything else here to add on the depressing Giants team before we talk about the Bills?
Josh, I noticed this during the Seahawks game 2 weeks ago that I'm a Giants fan, and over the last 10 years, I think they're my least favorite team in the whole league to watch. It's just like a misery. And then I ask you this question, what does this team do well? I think the answer is nothing.
Yeah.
I think it's nothing. And if we're being honest here, Josh, the season's over. Let's see if Jalen Hyatt and Wan'Dale Robinson can be long-term answers at wide receiver. That's where I'm at on the Giants right now, Josh.
Have to agree there. Let's turn to the Bills. Josh Allen now has at least 22 fantasy points in 4 straight games, 28 fantasy points per game over that stretch. He'll be moving up a tier in my rest of season rankings and trade value chart that comes out Wednesday. Ryan very sharply said, Josh Allen you can move him up as the one quarterback in tier 3. And I said, I put him at the top of tier 4. I thought about it. I'm going to give it one more week. I probably should have done it. I think you were right there. Nice call. Josh Allen, welcome to tier 3. I hope you enjoy the cushy living situation there. And then one last Bills note, Gabe Davis is the only wide receiver now in the NFL who has at least one end zone target in all 5 games. He's got a lot of touchdowns on the season, and that does not appear to be a fluke where they are clearly making an effort to get him into the end zone. He's a pretty big body, and we don't hate that Josh Allen happens to be his quarterback. Josh Allen, one of the most fearless quarterbacks when throwing the ball downfield. What else do you want to add here on Josh Allen? To me, at least, he looks like the potential MVP front runner through 5 games.
Yeah, I said last week too, that I think he could go to coast to coast in the award race. I think it's actually going to boil down to him and Purdy. You can't count out Mahomes, obviously, but I'm probably going to bet on Josh Allen at plus 700 in the MVP race now. He dipped a little bit. Wasn't a huge, again, we talked about this. I viewed Bills Jaguars as a 50-50 game because of the London situation. And let's talk about that for a second here, Josh. So here's the thing. I'm giving Buffalo a complete pass on this game because Jacksonville essentially got a home game in Europe. That's never happened before. And like you mentioned this before, the fact that this counts as a home game for Buffalo, like can we consult as gatekeepers for the schedule? We're just like, hey, listen, guys, I understand this is hard and we can't get everything right, but like this is a little ridiculous. So I'm giving Buffalo a complete pass, and they are in an absolute destruction spot. Bounce back spot, playing the Giants at home on Sunday Night Football. This could be really bad. If 14.5 points, like they're basically begging you to take the Giants too, which I would not.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we'd both agree, stay away from betting the Giants in any fashion right now.
Yeah.
Final game for week 6, Monday Night Football. I'm excited. You're excited. Cowboys at the Chargers. I was a little surprised by this. The Chargers 1.5 point underdogs at home, coming off of a bye week when the Cowboys just got horribly embarrassed. I'm not saying that I think the Chargers should be big favorites, but I would have set the line at like Chargers -1. Maybe I'm just a biased Chargers fan. I'll get your take in a minute.
Yeah.
Game total's 48.5 or 48. That's pretty high. Yeah. Just right now, stroke the Chargers ego. They should probably be right. -1, -1.5 feels a little more fair. Give the Chargers a little respect.
At least. Yeah. At least maybe -3. I probably would have had a -3, honestly.
I think I'm actually going to bet this when we get off the show. Yeah. So thank you. My homerism coming in handy here. Talking about Dallas, not much good coming off of the embarrassing, I don't even remember, was it 42-10, 49-10?
42 to very
42.
little, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 42-10. CeeDee Lamb has exactly 4 catches in all but one game this year. He only has one game with at least 15 fantasy points. His target share has been under 20% in all but one game as well. I'm starting to get concerned. It's not even just a Lamb problem. It's systemic. Dak's looked fine. He hasn't looked particularly good. I think he's looked kind of like the 16th best quarterback in the NFL at many times this year. Like him and Derek Carr are putting on their best, like very average quarterback impressions. And then I talked about this in the offseason, and I looked foolish the first few weeks, but I said, guys, I'm not anti-Tony Pollard, but I'm not gung-ho about Pollard in fantasy because he's never had a big workload, and we know that running backs generally break down late career when they're going to get their first big workload. Is that happening with Tony Pollard? And how? So that's the first question. Second question, 1 to 10, where's your panic meter on this Cowboys team?
See, we don't go into this knowing what we're going to say, so that one caught me a little bit. My panic meter is 0. Okay. So I'm going to explain that. Let me backtrack a little bit here. First, Dallas deserves to lose this game for firing Kellen Moore. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, Kellen Moore revenge game.
Can we agree on that? Yeah. Tony Pollard, when he hasn't played well, it's a running back not having a great game against the 49ers, like that's fine. That's not a problem at all. They've been the best run defense in football for years, but it seems like he crushes cupcakes and has struggled against, bigger teams, which is kind of what the offense is in general, and to your point with what you said about Carr versus Dak, if you ask me, Josh, would you rather have Kirk Cousins, Jared Goff, or Dak Prescott? Dak Prescott would generally be third on that list for me. I don't really have a big problem with him not playing well in San Francisco last night. That's a brutal environment. Sunday Night Football, prime time against the best defense in the league, best team in the league. Fine. You've laid an egg. You've done it before. No problem. But going back earlier, he didn't come back against Arizona either, and that's why I'm concerned with the offense. So maybe the panic meter should be a little higher than 0, Josh, just because I'm losing faith in the offense that I really didn't have a ton of faith in to begin with.
You know what? It's okay. You didn't give me a fun panic meter answer, but you told me that I can legally bet on the Chargers when they are plus 1.5 at home, coming off of a bye week with so much rest. Now, folks, before we get you out of here, reminder to follow Ryan at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Make sure to hop into our free Discord, start sit, trade advice, player prop bets, DFS showdown advice, just general questions that you have about the game for Ryan, myself, Jordan, a lot of our other fantastic contributors. Hop in there. It's linked in all of our free articles on the 33rdteam.com. Ryan's power rankings will be up on the site within the next 24 hours. My fantasy rankings will be up on the site as well in the next 24 hours. My rest of season rankings and trade value chart will be up on the site Wednesday. Ryan's picks and predictions for every game come out Thursday. His island game previews will be coming out throughout the week for Thursday Night Football, Sunday Night Football, Monday Night Football. And on Saturdays, he'll let you know exactly what he's betting on with every single game. Now, we'll get you out of here on this. Ryan mentioned last week, week 5 would be underdog week. And it was. We saw the Jaguars beat the Bills in London. The Steelers came back and upset the Ravens. And then our favorite, the Jets beat the Broncos, where head coach Robert Saleh gave former Broncos head coach Nathaniel Hackett the game ball because that's what Sean Payton deserved. It's a new week. It's week 6. Ryan, what's the theme?
Josh, I've been on football in so many different ways. When it's underdog week, I'm focused in on winner pools, because I'm gonna be against the field in a lot of directions. So I did very well in that format this week. Now this week, this is more of a general football week for me this week because I feel that this is who are these teams? That's the theme this week. We're gonna find out who the Vikings and Bears are. They're in a loser leaves town matchup basically. Whoever loses this game is pretty much more or less done for the season. And you know what? I think it's closer than most people realize between these two rosters. Can the Bucs beat the Lions? This isn't we already know who the Lions are. They're banged up, but what is Tampa Bay going to do? Because they got their doors blown off by the Eagles. What are they going to do against Detroit? Another one. The Chargers Cowboys, a great Monday night game. Who are the Dallas Cowboys? You just got embarrassed on Sunday Night Football. What are you going to do against a Chargers team that's coming off a bye and pretty dangerous themselves? The most important one, though, Josh, the Seahawks and the Bengals. We saw Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase destroy the Arizona Cardinals. Do we really care too much about that at the end of the day? I don't. Can they beat a real team like the Seahawks? If they can, the Bengals are then back.